Well, good evening. My name is Frank Bowles. I'm the disembodied voice that's talking over that slide you're looking at on your screen. I'm the director of the Clark Historical Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's presentation about aquatic invasive species in Michigan. Although the slide does say it's a part of the Clark Historical Library online speaker series for this semester, this particular presentation is co-sponsored by two other libraries, and we'd like to acknowledge their assistance: the Saginaw Chippewa Tribal Libraries, and also our partners, the University Library here at CMU. In particular, the University Library received a grant from the American Library Association, which in part is funding this evening's presentation. So we thank the ALA for that support. Okay. What we'd like to do tonight to begin our presentation is to share a recognition of the land, and we'd like to begin today here in Mount Pleasant, where we are broadcasting from, and throughout much of Michigan, where most of you are listening, by recognizing that these locations are part of the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe peoples. In Mount Pleasant, we specifically recognize this as the land of the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe, but for those of you joining us today from other locations, we urge you to take the necessary time and learn about the land where you currently find yourself and the indigenous peoples who have lived and continue to live on the lands. To recognize the land is an expression of gratitude and appreciation to those whose territory we reside on, and a way of honoring the indigenous peoples who have been living and working on the land from time immemorial. It's important to understand the long-standing history that has brought us to reside on this land and to seek to understand our place within that history. We'd also like to use tonight's presentation to share with you a related program which will be available this September, and it's an online exhibit, Big Water Creates Big Impact. This is a collaboration, again, with CMU Libraries and the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe, the purpose of which is to highlight the impact of large water events in mid-Michigan. This would include everything from floods and rainstorms and pollution to erosion and other incidents involving rivers, lakes, streams, and water supply in the mid-Michigan area. We welcome submissions from everyone. We hope to have a very large group of submitters. This can be individuals or groups who have been directly impacted by water, by big water events, or who have not been directly affected, but who have thought about the subject. We will be accepting various kinds of medium, written or spoken words, such as journalism or poetry, visual images, such as paintings, drawings, photography, mixed media, or audiovisual images, as well as 3D images, such as sculpture or fiber art. Any combination of the above are welcome. We encourage you to begin submitting the material beginning March of 2021, and the exhibit, as I said, will be in September. With that announcement, let me share one piece of housekeeping, and that piece of housekeeping is that, as many of you have probably already noticed, your microphones are muted. Because we have about 60 people joining us tonight, we have chosen to mute all your microphones, so we won't be picking up a lot of background noise. However, we encourage you to ask questions. If you'd like to ask questions, please use the chat feature of the software. It's probably on the right-hand side, the lower right-hand side of your screen. And please enter any questions you have for our two speakers this evening, and we will relay those questions to them. I will relay those questions to them, and I'm sure they'll do their best to answer. With that, I'm going to turn the presentation over to CMU librarian Rebecca Rennery, who is going to introduce our first speaker.
Well, thank you, Frank. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to share that in honor of our speakers and to thank them for being here today, tribal librarian Ann Heidemann and myself have chosen 12 books to be added to both the collection of the Tribal Library and the CMU libraries. These books were chosen because they relate to our speakers' professional work and are intended for a wide range of audiences. A book plate will be added to each book to say that they've been added in honor of our speakers. And with that, I am very happy to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Anna K Monfils. She is a professor of biology and director of the Herbarium, CMC, at Central Michigan University. She is also a faculty member of the Multidisciplinary Institute of Great Lakes Research and heads up the National Science Foundation funded Biodiversity Literacy and Undergraduate Education BLUE project. Her lab at CMU studies the origin, pattern, and maintenance of biodiversity, and her research spans several disciplines, including methodologies from systematics, taxonomy, museum science, biodiversity informatics, and field ecology. She has done extensive collaborative research on the landscape and local drivers of biodiversity and prairie fen ecosystems, including work with the federally protected Pau-Chic skipperling butterfly. A current research area involves determining best practices for management actions and outcomes for aquatic invasive plants, including an adaptive management framework for European frogbit. Dr. Monfils received her Bachelor of Science from Notre Dame University and her PhD from Michigan State University, where she was also a postdoc. And I will now turn it over to Dr. Monfils.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Let's see. I think I'm sharing now. Just as a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about in sort of the beginning here is what is European frogbit? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about what we know about the biology of the species and its history in North America, and specifically its history as it became an invasive species in Michigan. Then we're going to talk about some efforts being made statewide to look at the effective management of European frogbit. And I'm going to finish at the end with a couple of ways that we as a community, the public in general, can help get involved with understanding the distribution and the occurrences of European frogbit. I'd like to start and acknowledge the number of collaborators that I have working on this project. This is the subset that I directly collaborate with, including my lab and collaborators at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory. And they've all significantly contributed to, if not led, parts of the effort that I'm going to talk about. So European frogbit is a free-floating aquatic plant, and it's invasive to North America. So it grows in a rosette, so it all comes out of one common central node, and it has heart-shaped leaves, so it's quite distinct. Floats on the surface of the water with the roots draping down into the water. Occasionally you might find it actually in the substrate itself if it's in low water levels. It reproduces via seed, and here we have some images that we've taken. Most of our images come from Michigan, so we tried to put the citations there. The seed, when it reproduces by seed, this is a sexual reproduction. Flowers are pollinated. Then once pollinated, they actually turn, recurve, and push down into the water, where they develop into green berry-like fruit, so fleshy fruit with lots of seeds. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble. There we go. Now, when we first started this project, there was the idea that maybe seed production was very rare in Michigan. And what we have found is that it's actually extremely common. It's been in every population where we have looked. Seed viability is coming out between 80 and 90%. These are very small seeds once they drop from the fruit. And you can see here where you have the Fletcher Pond examples next to a dime, as well as where we have our seed germination test showing the high levels of sort of germination success. It also reproduces asexually, and that's where it's most known. It has two mechanisms with which to do that. It forms clonal groupings or clonal rosettes made up of the primary plant, a stolon or sort of extended stem, and then a second rosette, and often strings of rosettes. As you'll see here in the picture, this is Blake Cahill, who's conducted much of this research, and you see the series of rosettes along a stolon. It can also reproduce asexually via a structure called a turion. Turions are wintering buds produced at the very tips of the stolon. They become detached, they will float to the substrate or bottom of the water and then germinate into new plants in the following year. We've seen evidence they can germinate more quickly. They don't need or have to go through an overwintering. And what we've done when looking at this work, and this is the work of Ryan Goebel, who you see in this picture here, is this diagram is showing some work that he did in Saginaw Bay, where he picked sites throughout the bay to put these Turian traps, and the Turian traps are up in this left-hand picture. And essentially those sat on the substrate, and as Turians would fall off of the plants, or the Turian rain would get caught within these baskets. And every week he would head out, pull out what you see there is the filter in the basket, put a new filter in, and then count the number of Turians produced. And so this figure you see here is he was choosing sites where he was going to put his baskets that had a high amount of EFB, so close to 100% EFB, which started to die off and decrease right at the beginning to middle of September. It was about that time that there was a sharp increase in the Turians that were dropping into the baskets that were produced pretty heavily during this latter part of the season. So along with a project to look at just the fecundity, how many of these are being produced, Ryan has looked at, well, depending on when they fall off, maybe there's some more viable than others, or what is the viability of the Turians to turn into an entirely new plant. And so far, with 9 weeks in, he's got 100% viability of those Turians. He's also looking at, well, what would happen if we were to dry these out? So let's use some examples of where someone might go out, be a duck hunter, and be out hunting in the fall, pick up Turians on their boots, take a week off, head back in, have some Turians. Are they likely to be able to survive that week out of water and persist and germinate the following year? And so he's got a lot of different, I think he has 2 time frames he's using. And then we modeled some examples that would be longer term real world, sort of if your boat was out and it was within the hull of your boat, what would happen? And we're going to be looking at those results to sort of to figure out just how persistent they can be and how viable they are given these different scenarios. This work here, which was done by Blake Cahill, was to address an information need of really looking at when do these occur, when they grow, and when do they go through the different life stages. And so again, looking at this graph, you see we could differentiate the data into what was happening in the Lower Peninsula and Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And we had a lot of different ways of gathering this data, one of which was we had a survey that went out to all of the managers so that as they encountered EFB in the field, they could record what state it was in. Is it flowering? Is it fruiting? Is it producing like clonal rosettes? And I think we had about 250 responses there. As well, we were doing research ourselves in Saginaw Bay where we were recording this every day. And then we had a very targeted study that Blake was conducting to look at all sorts of associated features with bioproductivity and life stages. So looking at this, we could get some pretty clear messages in the Lower Peninsula where we had over 600 observations. We could also see some trends, but would like to get some more observations going on with the Upper Peninsula. But based on the data that we have, we see about a month delay between when the plants are emerging as those initial rosettes, when they might be moving into producing daughter plants, so their first sort of reproductive strategy, when they flower, and then when they move to fruiting. And you can see that the progression as it comes through. Then the last that happens in the season is the Turian production. Kind of showed that in that figure that I showed from Ryan. What's interesting here is we just have, did we see it or not see it? Doesn't matter if we saw it in 1 or we saw it in 250. But these lower ones for the Michigan Lower Peninsula, these June and July and early August ones actually are a rarity. They don't and aren't often produced then. But where we did find them was in areas where the plants were in high levels of stress, indicating that they might be producing these Turians if the water levels get too low, if they end up on like a Phragmites rack and slightly out of the water, that they might move their resources into Turian production. So here's a map from iNaturalist that shows the native distribution of EFB, which is primarily in Europe and parts of Asia. And as a matter of fact, it's an area of conservation. There is a conservation concern about several of the areas where it occurs. Where it occurs, however, in North America, it is invasive. you can see here how it consolidates around the Great Lakes region, but there are two other sites where invasive EFB occurs. One is a single site in Washington State, and another is a site that occurred about 2 years ago in India. So looking at how it's moved into the Great Lakes region, it was first recorded outside of cultivation in Ottawa in 1939. So it was originally brought in and was part of an arboretum. So it was noted, and there's records that that was brought in as a plant. And by 1939, it's being observed growing naturally or having naturalized within the system. It was first recorded in the US in the coastal wetlands in the St. Lawrence Seaway, and that was in 1974. Was first recorded in Michigan in the Huron-Erie corridor in 1996. And since that time has spread from, this is a map that's showing 1950 to 2020, and it's showing this North American spread. The map updates in 1-year intervals until it begins to slow down in 2010, where we started to see more targeted survey work, and you can see and note that the map starts to really, you start to see a much larger distribution. So this data comes from lots of historical records as well as different respective research projects, but it gives you an idea of how an invasive plant can spread through a system. I'm letting it get to the end of 2020. So you find EFB in wetlands associated with the Great Lakes. So the coastal wetlands you find them in, and you also find them in inland water bodies. When we first started working with this plant 2 years ago, the biggest priority was preventing it from getting into inland water bodies. And within a year, we found that it was occurring there. Then it's been more of a focus to try to prevent it from moving across the state. And we've noted a lot more populations in the last year. It's now made it into the western part of Michigan. It commonly occurs in areas with emergent vegetation. So you find it with invasive Phragmites and invasive typha. But you also find that it can be found with native populations of Chenoplectus and Sparganium. It grows in dense floating mats, though this isn't how you always see it. So these are some examples. This is an example on the left of a dense floating mat. It's sort of the picture that you imagine when you see of it. It seems that that would have a large impact on a system. But we have lots of sites in Michigan, sites that have been here since the 90s, where it persists but in low levels, floating among emergent macrophytes. So this series of slides is really to take you through what we've known and where exactly it is occurring in the state. So we start off by saying in 1996, it was in the Huron-Erie corridor. You see that down there, and we're denoting this with sort of illuminating the entire county. In 2010, it was recorded in Muskong Bay in the Upper Peninsula, and had also expanded its distribution within the Huron-Erie corridor. The next record was Saginaw Bay in 2011. And you can see here, but as we watch Saginaw Bay and move to 2013, you'll start to see some expansion of all of the sites. We first saw it in the westernmost part of its range in Reeds and Fisk Lake in 2016. By this time, most of Saginaw Bay and all the counties in Saginaw Bay had recorded its occurrence. In 2018, we saw it in Oakland County ponds. And then in 2019, we started to see the distribution really expand, where we saw it in Grand River, Pentwater Lake, and we had an observation in Dansville. And this is where I'm going to take a moment to talk about how important things like a citizen science site like our Naturalist are. If you look, this site is between the sort of known range and the emergent range that could be getting into Lake Michigan. So we determined this from an iNaturalist observation. So someone had gone into the system, taken the pictures, those pictures showed up on iNaturalist. We now check iNaturalist regularly, but it's a good way of showing how those observations can really expand our knowledge about an organism. And then in the last year, we've seen it in Waterloo State Rec area, Iosco County, and in Mackinac County. And here is the overall Michigan distribution of EFB now based on the populations that we know to be here. So the next step is to talk about, well, we know we have this invasive species that's moved through the state. And we started about 2 years ago looking more aggressively at how we could think about management at a state level. And I think that's a critical part of understanding this, is that at a state level, we can think about European frogbit management, and we can take a lot of those local efforts and work together to try to have a more comprehensive response that can prevent spread, can prevent new populations of this occurring. And so what this came out of some funding and some ideas that came really out of Sarah Lesage and Billy Kuiper from Eagle to start a collaborative effort across the state with the stakeholders involved in the management of European frogbit. So this included the local cooperative invasive species management groups. It included anyone at any level managing within the state, and it included decision makers for deciding what to fund or how to approach different issues with invasive species in the state. So what you see right here is just the front page of our website. We've had that live for, I think, about a month now. And you can go there to find any of the information that I've just presented here. And you can also find out any ongoing and current initiatives, but you can also find out about advances we've made in that collaborative approach to management. And so one of the things my lab's been involved in, and that's being led by Blake Cahill, is development of an adaptive management strategy. And that is not only a strategy that would cross the state, but it's one that would update annually, would be based in measurable goals, and that would address a set of core common sort of strategic outcomes. So one of the first strategies decided was we need to know where this is. And I think that's really critical because we can't get into managing it if we're not even sure of the extent of the problem. And this came together. There's a working group specifically looking at developing and piloting a standard protocol for monitoring within the state. They created a centralized data management system. And so you see this Eagle AIS survey that's in the left here. This is a way that anyone can record observations of European frogbit, and that can go into a common data portal. And they also developed some standard operating procedures for how to look at this and how to review it. And you can see this here with the Waterloo State Wildlife Area. The second strategy was to assess the impact of ongoing EFB control efforts. So to do this, there needed to be a standard way to say, well, how are we looking at management in the state to determine how effective it is? And you see him here. Here's Blake in the Grand River. And he was charged with working with the community to come up with a plan for how you could do pre-post management that was realistic, was feasible, and was scientifically valid. And so he has published that STIMP protocol. You can also find that on our website. Then he worked really closely with Rachel Hackett from the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, as well as people from MISN, to develop an app, or I think it's an app, to be able to go in and do your pre-management assessment and your post-management assessment and have that incorporated into the Michigan Invasive Species Network information and data. Well, then Blake's next step was to go around the state, and each one of these orange dots represents a management action that he did a pre-post assessment on, and would go out and apply the STIMP not only to see if the management was effective, which his data is still incoming on that, but it's also to optimize the methodology of the STIMP. So there is a working group that oversees this as well. There are a couple of funded groups that are looking at specific questions about best management practices. And there is a group also looking into if you could take this STIMP plan and apply it within an inland lake, how would you modify that into some sort of point intercept methodology? The third strategy was to look at educating recreational professional stakeholders about EFB. And here are some examples of some of the resources that have been developed. We also did a survey for stakeholder level of concern for EFB. What we found is there was a high level of concern about native flora, native fauna, and about sort of recreational sports. This group has, again, a working group that's been working over the last year. They've been compiling all of the resources that exist for EFB outreach and education. And the CMU team administered the stakeholder level survey to get an idea of what the community was really thinking. Was this a priority? Was this a resource that people wanted to, did people want resources put towards management of this aquatic invasive? So the last strategy is pretty broad, and that is to address critical information needs. Now, when this project started and we started developing these, those critical information needs were, as a priority, the actual and perceived impacts of EFB. We don't actually know what the impact of European frogbit would be within a community. We think, because of the fact it's an aquatic species, because we see how it grows, that it could impact the water quality and the native biota. It could also impact people's ability to conduct sports and to utilize water resources. And so we have indications that that could be an area to look into, but that became a priority. Several of us have been funded individually to look at that. The other thing to look at is when we started this, we did not know that the seeds were produced. Matter of fact, the inference was that this was rare. We now find it's very common and they're very successful. Then we didn't have an idea of turions and how long turions could persist, or how many turions were actually going to be produced by plants. We also didn't know about the flowering stages, what times of year different things happened. So we've been working towards some understanding there. The next priority was treatment efficacy. There's a lot of effort and a lot of time. The primary management methods are there's a chemical treatment, but it's still primarily hand removal. And that can literally be tons that are removed from a system. And so is that effective, and is the time and effort that goes into it? And is it possibly, and there's been concern, does that agitate the plant? Does that create production of more turions? So a lot of these management things need to be implemented and then assessed. And then really came important to understand the spatial and temporal distribution of European frogbit. So this meant reaching out and determining the historical occurrences. Well, at the time we didn't have that data, but now we do. And I showed you some maps that show sort of the progression of the invasion. We were looking for potential distribution and where we would expect to see this, and then looking at pathways and vectors of spread. So all of these things, or many of these things, are currently being addressed by researchers. This is an example of many of the research projects that we know of as of 2020 that have been funded to specifically address European frogbit. Now, I told you at the end here that I would come back and show some ways that the public could get involved in this conservation effort. And I cannot overstate how important this is. Michigan's big. We can't go out and look at every single water body or go with and continue to monitor that. What we can do is reach out to the community and say, if you see this, if you see this little plant, take a picture. Take a picture and load it up onto Misson. You can download a Misson smartphone app. There's the information for that. You could do this through iNaturalist if you're more comfortable using that as a resource. And you can even contact Eagle with their Aquatic Invasive Species program. They actually have alerts so that anyone putting a new EFB occurrence record up, they get alerted that day right away to the fact that that's been noted in that area. So I have to acknowledge and again say that really the work that's done here, what is special about it is the fact that it's been done as a collaborative, that all of these parties are involved, that they come together once a year to share information and work together across the year to write grants together and to develop an adaptive strategy to be thinking sort of holistically about how to approach European frogbit while they're making decisions at local levels. And again, I have to acknowledge and thank these people for their contributions, as well as reach out to Eagle, specifically Sarah Lesage and Billy Kuiper, who spent an extensive amount of time working on this. I also have to acknowledge my direct collaborators at the Michigan Natural Features Inventory, and that's Mike Monfils, Yuman Lee, and Rachel Hackett. And then I want to make a point of acknowledging the people that are really doing the work. And so here is my awesome team of graduate students who've been working to answer a lot of these questions, to help organize and run these meetings, and give us as much information as we can about this species. So thank you, Rebecca. I hope my phone went dead in the middle of that, so hopefully I was close to my mark in time.
Thank you very much, Anna. And we're going to pass it over to Ann Heidemann, who's going to introduce our next speaker. Please remember, if you have questions, please put them in the chat at any time.
Do you want to change the presenter?
Bonjour, everyone. Ann Heidemann Dishnakas, Saginaw Chippewa Akin and Donjaba. My name is Ann Heidemann, and I serve as the Tribal Librarian for the Saginaw Chippewa Tribal Libraries. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our next speaker. Chase Stevens started as the Invasive Species Coordinator for the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe in 2017, and since then has led efforts to treat and address over 260 acres of invasive species on tribal properties. He and his team have built the capacity of the tribe's invasive species program to be self-reliant, so the tribe is able to address any invasive issues without the need of outside contractors. They work with regional, state, and federal partners to address invasive species issues in the central and northeastern portion of the Lower Peninsula. And one more reminder that you're welcome to use the chat for any questions that you may have. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Chase.
Good evening. How are you guys all doing tonight? All right, I'm going to start out by giving a brief overview of our invasive species program here at the Saginaw Chippewa Indian Tribe. So it's 100% grant funded. We get most of our funds through different BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, BIA, GLRI grants. The goals of our program is obviously prevent the introduction of new species and to manage the ones that are already present. Now, invasive species have a direct negative impact on many of the plants that hold a significant cultural importance to us as Anishinaabe people. And these are plants that we utilize as traditional medicines as well as traditional food sources. So in order to protect those, we work with regional partners and collaborate to not just try to manage them on tribal lands, but on our neighboring partner lands as well. So with that, our partners primarily consist of the different SISMAs. So we work directly with the Central Michigan SISMA, as well as the Saginaw Bay SISMA, and a little bit with Huron Pines. So our invasive species program began in 2017, and since then we've surveyed and mapped over 4,000 acres of tribal properties. We were able to begin treating invasive species on tribal lands, and we treated over, as Ann said earlier, 221 acres of species on the tribe's lands alone. We'll be building on that work and have plans to address an additional 120 acres of invasive species this year. And some of the equipment that we've been able to purchase through different grants in the BIA include a Marshmaster, skid steer with a forestry head so we can address terrestrial wooden species, as well as a dash system, which is a diver-assisted suction harvester, so then we can address Eurasian water milfoil that is threatening some of our wild rice beds. With that, we've carried out a series of hardwoods plantings. So in the last 2 years, we've restored 30 acres, and it's in our plans this year to address an additional 95 acres. And again, as we're able to get more equipment and build our program, then we're able to have more ambitious projects. So on the tribe's properties, these are the main species that affect us. So in the top picture there, you can see what one of the properties looked like before, and then the bottom is after treating it. And then we seek out additional funds, so then the next year we can go through and conduct those hardwood plantings and all that I was talking about. So some of these terrestrial species that have had significant impacts on tribal lands and culturally important species are like the emerald ash borer. So black ash and white ash were both culturally significant plants to us as Anishinaabe people. And with all the damage that the ash borer's done, you know, that's had a huge impact on how our tribal citizens are able to gather and even partake in, you know, cultural aspects like basket making. So, you know, there are entire families that are known for being basket making, for making black ash baskets, and that's becoming almost impossible, or else they're having to travel out of the region to get the resources and able to continue those practices. Some of the aquatic species that affect tribal properties are Phragmites, Eurasian water milfoil, European frogbit, narrowleaf cattail, and zebra mussels. And again, a lot of these species directly impact culturally significant species to us as a tribe. So, you know, Phragmites directly competes with our native cattails, as well as, you know, like our different dogwoods that we use in traditional medicines, things like bulrush that we use in traditional mats, and Eurasian water milfoil, as I hit on a little while ago. That's up by the wild rice beds in Lake Tawas. So Lake Tawas has the largest wild rice beds in the state of Michigan, and there's significant amounts of Eurasian water milfoil moving in there. So I'll hit on a little later, but you know, we're doing things like getting that dash system so then we can do non-chemical treatments in the vicinity of significant, culturally significant plants like wild rice. So a couple pictures of Phragmites. Since our program started, we've been able to treat 151 acres of Phragmites on tribal lands alone, and we partnered with our SISMA partners in the Saginaw Bay, and they've been able to treat a couple hundred more. As I was just talking about, Eurasian water milfoil, it forms dense mats, and again, this is a direct threat to wild rice. And you know, for us as Anishinaabe people, wild rice is part of our migration story to this region. So with that, we purchased that dash system where the diver goes down and hand removes it, and it gets taken up on top to a barge where crews filter it out through filter bags. And this allows us to treat it and remove it and still be in the direct vicinity of rice without introducing chemicals to that food source. So the picture on the left shows a picture of what Eurasian water milfoil looks like. And this is the difference between the native and non-native species. So the native species, or the invasive species on the left, you can see when that's pulled out of the water, it loses its form. The native species on the right, that maintains its form when it's pulled out of the water. And the invasive species has at least 12 leaflets or more, and the northern species normally doesn't have more than 10. And then now to European frogbit. So since 2017, we started conducting frogbit polls primarily as an outreach project with our partners from the Saginaw Bay SISMA. So the first year, we hand removed over, I think it was 2,200 pounds of frogbit from a small cove over off the tribal properties on the Saginaw Bay. And since then, we've continued to do those. We've removed over 5,000 pounds over approximately an 18-acre area. And so here's a couple pictures of some of our tribal citizens and staff out conducting these polls. And we've had a mixed amount of success. So in open water areas, so going back to that last slide, you can see that willow tree in that left picture. So on this side, this is the next year, which we would have took the drone imagery of the before pictures. But you can see we had a pretty significant amount of success in removing it from the cove there. So when we went back the next year, that first year we were there, we filled up entire truckloads of frogbit. And when we went back to that area the next year, we filled up maybe 4 or 5 gallon buckets of it. And now we basically go back there and, spot remove it every year. So this is a different drone angle. So this whole little inlet here, we had 25 or 30 people between us and the SYSMA and tribal members and, people from different tribal departments out there helping us. So that 22 or 2,500 pounds that I mentioned, that was removed in the course of like 4 or 5 hours. So this has primarily been outreach events that we do a couple times a summer, but with, I guess, more effort, we could definitely have a lot more effect. But on these open water areas like this, we've had a very significant amount of success in not having it reoccur the next year. However, when we do holes in drains and ditches, that has almost no effect, and it's back in the same, density the following year. So as I mentioned earlier, we couldn't do any of our work or really be successful without partnering. So our main partners are the SYSMAs. So the Central Michigan SYSMA and the Saginaw Bay SYSMA. We also do a lot of work with the local conservation districts, where we organize and conduct outreach and education events, going to schools. So I have up there the contacts for the Central Michigan SYSMA as well as the Saginaw Bay SYSMA coordinators. So if any of you live in those areas, then these are the people that can help you out if you have any questions or having any invasive species issues. They can, at a minimum, provide you the resources, and depending on funding, potentially help you treat invasive species issues on your property. So, as was mentioned before, some things you can do to help is, downloading stuff like the Missing app. And the Missing app is a free app. It allows you to take a picture that geotags your location, and all of the SYSMAs in the state use the Missing app. So by doing that, that assists your regional invasive species, land managers, and allows them to help formulate their management plans. And so the SYSMAs use Missing, as well as, this is the DNR, as well as like the Fish and Wildlife's primary means of reporting it as of right now. So there's the link to the Missing website, as well as the MNFI website. But do I have any questions for me at this time?
And this is Frank again. I want to remind everyone to please use chat. I do have a couple of questions here. The first one that came in actually was more for Anna. It was more for you. It was a question that someone asked, is if it's normal for an invasive species to start as slowly as those maps you put up show, and then suddenly take off like it is, like frogbit is doing right now in Michigan. Is that a common pattern, or is that unusual?
I think looking at some of the other watch species, this isn't uncommon. That's based on looking at some of the most recent ones that have come in. So I've worked with Starry Stonewort that did a very similar thing. Within a short period of time, it became very common, but we think it may have been around a little bit longer. But then it's like time is relative on that one. Some of the times too, it has to do with whether people are recognizing the species. The other thing is when you see those points on that map, that's when people made observations. Sometimes when you either have a species in decline or a species that's growing, you're getting a lot more attention to the survey work. So those populations could be all new, or they could be the result of the effort to determine if the populations are there. So I do think it would be an interesting question. I would like to learn more information about. So I'm definitely going to look into that and see what some of these patterns are if we were to track a bunch of different aquatics that same way. So thank you, whoever asked the question.
Thank you for the answer. Chase, I've got a question that somebody asked about the tribal's efforts to control frogbit. They noted that what you were doing seemed to be largely organic. You weren't using any chemical poisons or material like that. And they wondered if you'd considered that, and if you had, why you rejected it.
We do chemical treatments. So, we do chemically treat Phragmites. We haven't done chemical treatments on frogbit. And that was primarily because our work with that was with our SISMA partners. So that was more of an outreach event to spread awareness about invasive species. So, the concept was just to have an event that got as many people as possible involved. So in order to do that, then, a frogbit pole is something that, you can bring your kids out to, anyone can do. You can do it from a canoe, you can do it in waders. If you don't mind just getting wet in your swimsuit, you can do it. So that was the real reason that we didn't use chemical treatments on frogbit. And, as we're addressing Phragmites issues on the bay, so on the tribal properties, as we address large stands of Phragmites, then, within the next year or two, we're starting to see the frogbit move in. And a lot of our, neighbors that have properties that border the tribal lands, they are now, they're completely cut off from the bay, and they have stated that they'd almost rather contend with the Phragmites that they had before than having to deal with the frogbit, because the only, the easiest way for most people to do it is hand removal. And but like I said, we had 15 or 20 volunteers, and in a morning we were able to remove, a literal ton. So, but yeah, the only reason that we didn't consider chemicals in that scenario was that it was an outreach event. Where in other areas, like with the water milfoil up at Tawas, that's because of the wild rice that's in the direct vicinity of it. And then just the significance that wild rice has to us as Anishinaabe people. Wild rice is what brought us to the region. So, we don't want to introduce chemicals to something that is still a major food source to us to this day.
Okay, thank you. And there's a follow-on question to that. Is there, and it's to either of you, is there an optimal time of the year when you should either hand remove or chemically treat frogbit? Or do you know?
Before the Turian swarm, so we try to do our frogbit poles by the end of July.
Okay. Chase, I got another question for you. What hardwood trees are being planted, and are you able to reintroduce ash trees?
Well, we could, but the emerald ash borer is still here, so then we're going to have to do treatments on the ash trees. So we absolutely could do ash tree restoration projects and all that, but then we'd have to stay up on that. So like the city of Bay City, they were very proactive in treating their trees. So they still have like 3,000 or 5,000 trees in Bay City that are fine. They just have to stay up on those treatments, and those can be expensive. But some of the hardwoods that we planted when we did those restoration efforts. So a lot of the tribal properties were fallow, or weren't being, they were prior agricultural lands that the tribe had purchased. So then they might not have been farmed for 20 or 30 years. So then we were removing all of those, like autumn olives and buckthorns and black locusts, honeysuckles, and then so the hardwoods that we planted were sugar maples, white oaks, sycamores, black walnuts, white paper birch.
Okay. There was another question, Chase, that says, have you been successful in improving, or have you seen improvement in the wild rice growing areas as a result of your work?
Oh, that's a year by year thing. So that's a real seasonal. So then, last year I thought the rice at Tawas looked significantly less dense than what it was a few years before that. This year there seemed to be a little bit more, but with that, we have been doing wild rice surveys on different water bodies and have mapped around 400 acres of it on a couple of the different river systems in northeastern Michigan as well.
Okay. I've got two related questions for Anna. What impact do these research projects have on the student experience for their post-degree careers, and do undergraduates work on these projects?
So yes, undergraduates work on the projects. Matter of fact, if you're interested, we are probably hiring 3 in this next field season on just this project. And then, yes, all the graduate students, they get real life experiences that are going to contribute towards the careers that they want. So I always think about it as a little bit by getting the hands-on, they're figuring out, do they want to keep their hands on this? The other thing is, I think I have pretty fantastic graduate students, but these students are also interacting with the professionals that they want to be. And so they're getting to work with all of these different stakeholders within the state. I think that gives them a real chance to see the dynamics of the field and learn about the different nuances of types of careers. So I have been working and operating under the fact that this provides them some excellent experience to prepare them for the careers that they want.
Okay. I have a follow-up question on ash trees, and I don't know if either of you can answer it. This is a person who has read that there's works being done to hybridize the ash trees for resistance to the emerald ash borer. I don't know if either of you know anything about that or would care to offer a thought, because it's a little bit off our topic tonight. And if you both sit there silently, I'll take that as a no.
Well, there's work being done with the Chinese ash tree because, that's the native ash where it's from. So then that's the work that they're referring to. But,
okay.
Yeah, that's about the extent of that.
Yeah, for those of us who have ash trees in our backyards, it's not too helpful. Okay. Wait a minute, I've got another question. I was about to say, I don't see any more questions, but Anna, is there any data in yet about how long the Turians survive on a fisherman's boots or another out of environment like that?
Well, so and I have to give a lot of credit to this to my graduate student Ryan Goebel, is he did some preliminary studies because he was just really interested in it the first year he started in the lab, and he left them out to dry, found that they could go a week without any issue. And so when we were talking about, how to model this, because, there's a difference between drying something out in a lab versus something left on the bottom of a boat that's outside that stays a little damp. And so he tried a series of things looking at different drying times, but he also took a bunch of it. It sounds very unscientific, but we did this in the most scientific way possible and basically left it out all winter. And the question being, if it's on your gear or it's on your boat and then it's reintroduced to the water, is that going to be able to persist? Because that would be a very different approach to how we had to worry about it moving around. Are we just worried within a season? And if it's out of the water 5 or 6 days, or are we seeing something that can persist on land for a period of time, just drying out, overwintering, and regerminate? We haven't yet seen results from those germination studies.
Okay, thank you. Chase, which invader, this is a good one. Which invaders not yet in Michigan are causing future concerns for the tribe? What's on your worrying list?
The longhorn Asian beetle, and then, the different Asian carps.
Okay. Unfortunately, sometimes you don't know what to worry about until it gets here, which is also a problem. Other questions? I'm staring intently at a white piece of screen here. I'm hoping if someone doesn't say something shortly, I think we're going to thank everyone for joining us tonight. It's been a very interesting presentation. If you're around next Thursday at 7 o'clock, we'll be doing from the Clark's speaker series, the International Children's Book Read. This is an event which is very, very popular. Unfortunately, we can't do it in person this year, but we've been recording students and other members of the CMU community reading children's books in their native language, and then sharing what the story is with those of us who obviously don't speak that language. So it's a fun evening. We hope you can join us. It will be on tape. I don't have any more questions coming in. So at this point, Thank you to everyone who's participated. Thank you to both our panelists for a very interesting presentation, and to Ann and Rebecca for doing introductions. Everyone have a pleasant evening and good night.